Spurs have the 5th highest net spend in the Premier League in the last decade. They're a top 6 team in terms of wages, but they're currently 10th in the league. Today, I'm joined by JJ Bull, Jack Pitt-Brooke, and Jay Harris to discuss, should Tottenham be better by now? Well, I mean, JJ, should Spurs be better by now?
Well, a good way to work out where a team should finish or how good they are is by looking at where they are in the league table from the wages they pay. And if we look at the 22-23 season, where Spurs were 5th on wages, and that season they finished 8th, which is maybe a small underperformance, but in that same season, Brighton and Newcastle massively overperformed their wage budgets, and so they were higher up the table. But Man United and Chelsea massively underperformed it. Chelsea not even in the top 10. Wow. This season, Spurs have the 6th highest wage budget, we think, and just around about the same as Aston Villa. And their underlying numbers show that they have the 2nd best expected goals and the 5th best expected goals against. And in fact, Opta's expected points model has them 3rd in the table.
Oh.
But in reality, they are 10th. Because sometimes the league table lies.
Yeah.
And if they had applied the same level of aggression intensity to the first half of their game against Ipswich as they did the second, I believe they may not have lost and may even have won. And if they had, by golly gosh, wouldn't you believe it, they would be 3rd, which is very much different to what we're looking at right now. Doesn't that look better than 10th?
It does look better than 10th.
It does look better than 10th.
I feel like it changes maybe the whole context of the conversation I've prepared.
Stop the show. But look what's happening. Villa are 2 points above Spurs because they have had 2 draws where Spurs have lost 2 games, which brings me to my final point, is that Spurs beat Villa 4-1, therefore they should be better than Aston Villa, but then Villa are 1 place higher, so therefore they're better than Spurs. It doesn't make any sense. Really, the expectation should be that Spurs should finish around 6th. I think success would be finishing in 4th. That's kind of the most realistic thing they could do. And the start of failure is probably finishing 10th, because if you look at the wage budgets, it's not exact always, but if you look at the wage budgets, what you see is that there is a top 4, but really there's a top 7, 8 or 9, then a middle 10, and then a bottom 2. And that is what we should expect from the Spurs.
Okay, fine. Well, guys, I think, as we've heard from JJ, that if they just beat Ipswich, for example, they'd be 3rd in the table, and maybe that would change the nature of the conversation we're having right now. But I think it's also important to remember how badly other big teams are doing. So I suppose if I ask you both, which camp are you in here? Camp A being they're performing okay, or at least the performances are pretty decent and 3rd would be fine. Camp B being, well, actually, you might expect more from them in a season where every big team apart from Liverpool is underperforming. Jack?
So Spurs' underlying numbers this season are very good. They're 2nd in the Premier League for expected goals for. They're only 5th in the league for expected goals against. They're 2nd in the league for shots for, and they're 2nd for shots against. So these are very, very good underlying numbers. But I think the problem is that not all of the performances have been that good, and they've lost too many games, and they've lost games that they should never lose. You know, they should never lose the game away at Crystal Palace. They should never lose at home to Ipswich. They should never lose away at Brighton when they're 2-0 up at half time. And so even though the sample size is small, they've lost 45% in their league games so far this season. I think that is probably unsustainable. But if they can kind of get that losing habit out of their system, and if performances can move in the direction of their very good underlying numbers, then I'm sure they will rise back up the table.
What about you, Jay? What do you think?
I'm probably more in the camp B, that they've played well but should be doing a little bit better. Like Jack said, they've lost 5 of their 11 Premier League games this season. And I think for a team who wants to win trophies, as Postecoglou's been very open about in the press this season, and for a team that wants to get back into the Champions League, you need to do a little bit better than that. I think I will give them a little bit of credit for the fact that it is a young team, and they probably massively overachieved what they were expected to do at the start of last season, and that probably long term's had a slightly negative effect on the perceptions of this team. You know, you win 8 of your first 10 games and end up finishing outside the Champions League places. I don't think that had ever been done before. But actually, the growth of this team, we're probably going to need a couple more years to see what they're fully capable of. You know, Van der Ven, I think, is only 23 years old. Radu Dragason's only 22 years old. Brennan Johnson's very young. This is a team that's still, I guess, in transition and sort of working its way to being exactly what Postecoglou wants them to be.
Okay, fine. And I suppose from a club perspective, like, what do you think, Jack, the club are expecting or would want from this season? Because they would have gone into it with, you know, an aim of where they finish, but they wouldn't have gone into it expecting Man City and Arsenal to not be playing well, right? So does that change their perspective?
So I went to an event recently where CFO Scott Munn was saying that what they really want is sustainable success. I don't think they necessarily want to go all out for a trophy this season. I think they would love to be back in the Champions League. They probably should have got into the Champions League last season. You know, they were very well set and then they had a pretty poor finish this season and allowed Aston Villa to overtake them. If fifth is to be a Champions League spot this season, I think it probably will be, then I think that should probably be the minimum target for Tottenham this season. Although from the fans' perspective, they would love to win a trophy. And Tottenham are doing well in the Europa League, they're in the quarterfinals of the Carabao Cup, and of course they've still got the FA Cup to come in January. So for many fans, I think that's really the priority for this season.
Jack's mentioned the fans, Jay. There was an interesting story published recently about watches that maybe could give some indication to how fans perceive the club what the club's desires are.
Yeah, so this came out, it's an excerpt from Hugo Lloris's autobiography, and he said that ahead of the 2019 Champions League final, Daniel Levy gifted all of the first team squad watches, which said, I think, Champions League finalist on it. And obviously that sparks debate about lots of different things. And I think the sort of accepted argument is that if you're going to give a present to the players, you either do it after they've won the trophy, or you don't engrave it until after the game.
Or get two different sets of watches and give them the one.
Yeah, or shell out on two different sets of watches. If you lose, you get these, Casio watches. If you win, you get these Patek Philippe's or whatever you want. And so I think that just I think Lloris sort of used that as Jack might correct me on this, but as a bit of a tool to sort of have a bit of a dig at the club's hierarchy for a perceived lack of ambition, I think.
Which is something that maybe you've seen other managers point out as well, like Conte, Mourinho, especially have talked about the mentality within the club.
They don't want it enough, Jack.
Yeah, so in Conte's famous rant at Southampton, where he basically detonated his time as Tottenham manager, it was his last ever act as Tottenham manager, he said that Tottenham players weren't used to playing under pressure. It was when he basically, he kind of threw the whole team, and really the whole club, under the bus in one of the most amazing performances I've ever seen. This was taken by some people as a sign that there is not a sufficient commitment at Tottenham to winning. And this was something that people have looked at the Lloris anecdote about watches and made a similar point.
Let's head to Italian club Piacenza, where they've taken the hire and fire routine with managers to a whole different level. They started the day with one coach who was sacked. His replacement came in, took one training session, and then he was sacked too. He'd been linked to match-fixing allegations in the past, and it sounded like the fans weren't too happy with his appointment. So they ended up with Stefano Rossini in charge, who himself had been sacked by Piacenza back in October. It's a right old merry-go-round, but as the saying goes, that's football. If you like this story, and you'd like to read more about it in the Athletic FC newsletter, click on the link below to sign up. We'll bring you the biggest stories to your inbox, Monday to Friday.
Okay. Well, appetite or not aside, I think it is possible. We've seen other clubs bridge the gap from where Spurs are now to maybe title challenge in the last few years, JJ. How exactly is that done, and is it possible for Spurs to make that jump?
Well, I think it all comes down really to recruitment, which includes hiring your top manager, and I think Postecoglou is a very good manager, getting better first-team players in, key players, then raising the floor with better squad players, then raising the potential ceiling with your better young players you bring in, and having strategic alignment from director of football all the way around, so it's all aligned. Now, we know that from the wage budgets, other teams have more room at the top, so they can hire better players, so they can get better players, which comes into all the tactics. It's not as if Spurs haven't tried, though, because they had the fifth highest net spend of any team over the last 10 years, which is a lot. So they have tried to get to the top level, but they're still sort of stuck there. So if you can't buy the best players to be the best technically and maybe beat teams that way, you need to find another way to close the gap, which other teams have done. And if you can't be best on the ball, perhaps you should be best off the ball.
Off the ball?
Yes.
Off the ball.
Because if you don't lose, if you don't concede, right? That's makes sense. You don't concede, you've got a good platform to build on. And what you want to do then, certain managers certainly will try to minimise risk and maximise opportunity to attack by doing that sort of thing. So you see a lot of managers will come in to correct a team that's maybe falling down a bit, but they always say they go back to basics, which basically means get behind the ball.
Yeah.
Minimise the risk and make sure you can attack when they make a mistake. You have to want it more, be horrible to play against. That's what you want to do. And to make this work, you need to bring in, I would say, better athleticism, bring in bigger, faster, stronger players to try and help you have big lads, big fridge freezers in the box for set pieces. And you also want to focus on your set pieces because they're worth about 25-30% of your goals a season. So a real focus on those will help, especially if you bring in bigger players, horrible to play against. Then you can have a few technical players high up the pitch, big lads at the back, create a siege mentality, start blaming referees and others around you, creating arguments for others. And what you may notice is that this is basically almost exactly what Arsenal have done, which is the best team to compare to Spurs. I'm sure all of you will like this, Spurs fans. If you look at what Arsenal have done and where they've got to, they similarly don't have the same amount of budget as people above them, but they've closed the gap. And they've done that by being the best off the ball, I would argue. So they are really good at pressing high, they're also really good at blocking low. They have everything kind of worked out. And in fact, Arteta, what you'll notice he's done since he came in was the first season he came in, they finished lower down the table, but their expected goals against was 13th in the league. And last season they had the best expected goals against records in the league. So it's about defensive first, really, is what he's done, kind of secretly in the background. And he's done that by minimising risk, by controlling every single phase. You don't have to just sit low in a block to defend, really. He kind of defends by having the ball in the opposition half, so you're slowing things down that way. And then he's also maximised his set pieces, so that possession has a purpose when the opposition half. He has technical players high up the pitch, but he has big lads behind. He's brought in athleticism. They're really big, Arsenal all over the pitch. He's created the siege mentality. He's brought light bulbs to team meetings, which I think has helped.
Light bulbs?
Yeah.
Oh, the picture.
Yes. Well, he brought a light bulb in, and then
a real one.
I think it inspired them.
Oh.
But I find with Arsenal personally, I don't know if you would agree, but when they don't win, it's not hugely fun to watch. It's about minimising risk and taking a lot of the fun out of it. That's how you control games. But he has gained an edge tactically by doing this, and he's evolved his tactics to make sure that Arsenal gain this edge. Now, we compared to what Postecoglou was doing and whether he should be doing better. Well, I think he has a clear style of play. They defend by attacking. Would you say that's fair?
Yeah, definitely.
Thank you, good. I've been approved. But they have technical players throughout the side. So they have really good players, like technically gifted all the way through. He's trying to create a winning mentality, like we just discussed. There's a mentality at Spurs that he's trying to correct. And I find them fun to watch as a neutral, even if they don't win.
That's true.
Because Postecoglou, I would say, he takes risks rather than avoiding them, because that's another way of playing the game, right? You don't always have to minimise it. You can try and create your own opportunities to score. But if we look at what Spurs have and why the relevance in the wage budgets and what players they have are, I'll just show you a little bit of what they do. So we roughly know how Spurs play now, and it's a 4-3-3, but all changes. And the game is that they want to have wide wingers wide. They want to have their attacking eights will attack these spaces here. There's a lot more to it, which we'll come on to in a second, but basically play a high line, push these guys up like this. And then the game really is to get the ball. Either a winger will play it from this sort of position here to the back post, or someone will get to the line and try and play a cut back from this sort of position here. Always trying to get to the penalty area or the back post. That's what Spurs do constantly, that kind of thing. And it's so predictable that they do this, that you actually start finding in games that teams can predict it's going to happen well before it happens. Here's the game against Ipswich, for example. Really well coached Ipswich. Brendan Johnson's on the right hand side here, the winger. He comes across. Might seem obvious, but the goalkeeper is so far ahead of the game here, knows exactly where the ball's going to go, that he comes out really early to catch it in these dangerous situations. You can predict it so clearly that you can do these sorts of things. Now, of course, if you're attacking like this and pushing yourself up, then you leave yourself open to people counter-attacking you, but Spurs counter-press, they try and win the ball high up. It's very aggressive. But one of the things we see that's different from what Spurs do to what a lot of other teams do, especially in the way like Arteta or Guardiola have evolved tactically over the last couple of seasons, is what the fullbacks do. These are really important because they're here on my current board, but actually you'll find Udogi's up here a lot of the time, maybe Sarr's here, and Porro will be around here, or something like this. And they will be in these sorts of situations quite regularly where there are clear counter-attacking opportunities to get away behind this high line that they play. And this is often what happens to Spurs. If we look at the build-up and where the fullbacks come into it, we see similar predictable patterns that they do that causes them problems, and we can compare that to what Arsenal are doing and why there's a difference here. So Spurs build up, they have back two, they have a player here, then you've got fullbacks, Porro and Udogi, who'll tuck in, so you have this three here. Now what you'll see often is when they build up like this, the opposition team block the pass into Bentancur or these guys here, and then they go man-to-man tighter on the back line so they can get everyone tight, so you can't get the ball out. And what other teams do when they play against them like this now is they set up in the same way. So what you see is Spurs is back 2 on the ball, then you see the opposition team has a 2-3-5 is what Ipswich did, and it kind of takes away all the options, you know where the ball's going to go. So you have to work out how do you get the ball forward. So one way you can play it out to the fullback, who might drop in, then Ipswich anticipate it, they drop in, they win the ball back. It's kind of dangerous. Aston Villa, same thing. So their shape became like a 2-3, kind of 5. They've got one loose player because they're going man-to-man higher up the pitch. Same thing, they pass around the back. How do you get the ball forward? No real short options, so they launch it long to one of the wingers. And like Son and Johnson aren't going to win a 1v1, but often you win the loose ball from the counter press, but you give up opportunities for the opposition to go at you. So then you need to find ways to sort of deal with this. And what Spurs do is lots of positional rotations to try and create opportunities and build up especially. So it's this weird kind of shape you get with Spurs. It's like this X. You see that? See the X? It's a good X. That's what you get.
I like an X.
But you want to disrupt this. So what you find, and did this at Celtic as well a lot, is that one of the players, like Sarr especially, or Maddison, will drop either in next to Bentancur to offer a little pass. So that's one of the things, and Udogie wanders up the pitch. And or maybe what you'll do is Sarr will move over to this wide left area, try and drag someone out of the way. That's what they'll do. But what you'll find is that the fullbacks go so far out of the way, it creates overloads and positional rotation so you can get the ball forward. But the problem is that when you go forward, if it turns over, you then have the problem of how do these guys get back into their positions to be able to defend in the right situations. And so if you're defending, you want like defenders or fullbacks to be defending. You don't want to have Maddison or Sarr or Kulusevski as your defensive line, because they often end up as the back ones, and that's the problem. Whereas if you look at what other teams have done in recent seasons, they've brought in fullbacks who aren't really fullbacks. They've brought in massive lads. I put it to you, Jack Pitt-Brooke, if you were to try and run against either Pedro Porro or Ben White, who would you rather run against with a football?
Now, don't be a contrarian. You answer the way is intended here.
I'll do it. Would you rather run against Destiny Udogie or Urian Timber?
I think that I would rather run against Urian Timber or Ben White.
Is that right?
You'd rather run
No, I wouldn't. I got it wrong. I would rather run against.
He's never coming back.
I can't get my head around this because I am so slow that I wouldn't stand a chance running with a football against any of these guys.
Well, Jay's quite fast.
Maybe
You're good at football. You answer.
I wouldn't say I'm fast, but I play football. I'd rather run at Porro than Ben White.
Right, so you put big, massive fullbacks who are centre-backs at the back and you create a sort of opportunity.
Jay can come back. Yeah.
Well, that's what you've got. So like Arsenal, I don't want to keep using Arsenal as an example, but because they slow things down because they minimise risk by having players there. So really defensive first. The joke is that they're a bit like Stoke now because they've got big centre-backs there, but they're really good players, like Timber especially. And so what then you get is like Arsenal push forward, but they look after their counter-pressing situations. They make sure they can't be counter-attacked. Everything is slow and on purpose because you can control the pitch, so you're minimising risk. So Ben White might push forward, sure enough, sometimes, and you get Saka coming inside. But what you'll get is they'll switch to like a 3. They'll always have like a 3-2 structure, or they'll have something that is protecting certain lanes of the pitch. Whereas Spurs don't do the same thing because they want to push up, push the ball forward, get it into the areas, create a sort of moment of chaos so you can try and pounce onto it and then create something, which makes it fun to watch. But it's more like end-to-end, like ping pong, basketball, something like that. And so then you start losing games to teams like Ipswich.
What, do you think Spurs have a pragmatism problem with the way that they play then in terms of trying to bridge that gap?
I think the way that they're set up firstly puts a lot of pressure on Mickey van der Ven. He's basically the ultimate cheat code or get out of jail card to have a defender who's that quick and can cover spaces so quickly. But it also means that when he's not available, and he's been injured recently with a hamstring issue, the replacement might not be as quick enough and can't do the same things. And the thing with pragmatism, I don't know if it feels like a little bit of a dirty word in Postecoglou's vocabulary, but he's just not going to change. He feels so strongly that this is going to work. It's brought him success in Australia, it's brought him success in Japan, it's brought him success with Celtic. And one thing that JJ mentioned was the set pieces. Tottenham have actually got better at set pieces this season, both from defending and from attacking. But it's quite interesting that Postecoglou basically called them like a scrum at a rugby game recently. So Postecoglou, if I was in his shoes, and obviously I'm just a Sunday League footballer, I'm not a qualified coach by any stretch of the imagination, I probably would like there to be a little bit of more security at the back when we're going forward, but that's just not how he is. This has brought him success before, he's going to keep going with it, and it might work, it might not. But to give him some credit, I do think in some of the games that Spurs have lost this season, I think that's more on the players and that they should have problem solved in those situations. And I think the prime example of that is when they lost to Brighton. If you're 2-0 up at half time and you can see that the winds are changing slightly, I think the players really need to themselves have a discussion on the pitch and say, we need to alter what we're doing slightly to prevent Brighton from coming back into the game. And I know I said that this Spurs squad is quite young, but there are still very seasoned internationals in there. Dejan Kulusevski is a Swedish international. Romero's won, I think, back-to-back Copa Americas and a World Cup with Argentina. Sometimes in those moments you need your leaders on the pitch, and I think that's where maybe Spurs have lacked a little bit this season.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that it's probably too simplistic to put all the blame for Spurs' inconsistency on the manager himself.
Yeah.
I think the players do have to shoulder a lot of responsibility. I think the best example, is, as Jay said, is Brighton. Tottenham played some fantastic football in the first half of that game. They were 2-0 up. They should really have been 3-0 up because Brennan Johnson misses a brilliant chance, basically the last kick of the first half. And then the second half, they just don't show up. It's as if they've stayed in the dressing room, and before they realise what's happened, they're 3-2 down. They can't get back into the game. And Postecoglou was devastated after that game. And I just think he's capable of getting the players to play to a very high standard, but at the moment, he's not able to get them to play to that very high standard every single week. And for whatever reason, there are, whether it's individual games or even just like a half within a game, there are moments where Spurs collectively switch off. And that, I think, is their biggest problem at the moment, because when the football works, it's really good.
I mean, sticking with the Arsenal comparison for a second, we've talked about how their play style maybe differs in terms of that pragmatism. I think another area where there are differences is recruitment. JJ mentioned Arsenal's recruitment. They've gone out and bought a lot of players that have strengthened their first team significantly. What do you make of Spurs' recruitment over the last 2 or 3 windows?
Yeah, I think that's been a big difference, really, hasn't it? If you look at the type of player that Arsenal has signed, they're players for right now, whether that's Ben White, Gabriel Jesus, Jorginho, Havertz, they're not really buying potential there. Whereas for Tottenham, I think in the last few years, they've done really well at buying young players. And as Jay said earlier, they've really refreshed the team with a bunch of guys who've come in, all in their early 20s, and they've been fantastic. Sarr, Udogie, Porro, Van der Ven, Brennan Johnson have all been very, very good. But in terms of established mid to late 20s players who can come straight in and improve the first team instantly, I think the only one really is Solanke in the last few years.
Yep.
And I think
pretty good one.
The criticism that people have made of their dealings in the summer is they did really well in terms of future potential. Archie Gray is clearly going to be an incredible player. Bergvall is very, very talented. Odobert, sadly, we haven't seen a lot of him yet because he's been injured. But Solanke was the only player they brought in for right now. And there's quite a lot of Spurs fans who will say, why didn't we buy more players for right now?
Yeah, but having, obviously we're giving Arsenal a lot of praise. We've got to remember that summer where they signed, I think it was Ramsdale, Ben White, Martin Odegaard, Takahiro Tomiyasu, they didn't start that season particularly well. I think that's the season where they lose their first 3 games. It took a while for them buying young players and letting that core grow before they then started supplementing it with Calafiori, Havertz, Jorginho, etc. So
I think about Saliba's introduction over time.
Exactly.
As well, right?
So I still think Tottenham are in the growth stage, and then maybe this summer or the summer that's coming up, that might be the one where they say, okay, now we're really going to augment the team with 1 or 2 more peak age players to take them to the next level.
I would say Klopp's Liverpool is maybe a really good example, and less antagonistic than Arsenal all the time, because when he came in, they improved instantly and they played. Spurs did get better, I think, when Postecoglou took them on, and they were second for a long time last season, wasn't it? At the start, I think.
Yeah.
But then what Klopp did was bring in key players, ones that elevate you massively, like Van Dijk, Alisson. Who are the other players? Wijnaldum, all these ones that really rose the level. Salah even, So they brought on these players, but it's all aligned, we're talking about. It's all aligned with what Klopp wanted to do and what's going forward. Whereas what Postecoglou maybe has now is youngsters who are going to turn into it.
I think Liverpool's a really good comparison with Tottenham, because if you wind the clock all the way back to 2017, 2018, Liverpool and Tottenham, I think, were basically as good as each other. I remember in October 2017, Tottenham walloped Liverpool 4-1 at Wembley. The great thing that Liverpool did, which Tottenham could never do, is to say, what are our 2 key positions that we need to improve? Centre-back and goalkeeper. Let's go and buy the best player, the best buyable player in the world in those positions, as you said, in Alisson and Van Dijk, even though they cost, Van Dijk was 75 million and Alisson was, I think, 65 million roughly. And that's something that Tottenham have never been able to do. They've never been able to buy the best player, the best buyable player in the world, really. And I think, until they are able to do that, or until they do that, they will always have to be focusing on potential and growth in the transfer market.
Okay. Well, it's clearly an exciting future. I think that's palpable from this conversation, Jack, isn't it? But what about now? The question of this show was should Spurs be doing better now? JJ?
I think they should be finishing round about 5th or 4th. I think the league table lies sometimes, and so I think they'll finish higher up.
So when you take the underlying numbers into account, you don't think they, apart from finishing the odd chance here or there, you think they're doing okay?
I think they're doing okay. I think people get it's a results business and people do focus on that. But I think you got to look at what you're doing. It is kind of more fun to watch than it has been in the past, and other options don't really exist. I think when you start going pragmatic, it can become quite boring. If it doesn't work, it's far worse than having something where at least you're like aspiring to something. If you don't take risks, what do you get? You don't really get anything. So I think it's what you should expect from them is probably to be roughly where they'll finish, which is probably going to be about 5th. But then I think what you need to see is that they have clear strategy and they're aligned and they go with big players that can take them to the next level. Otherwise, they're just constantly chasing something.
Jay?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think they should be doing a tiny bit better, but they're 10th in a very, very bunched league. So like we said, the Ipswich and the Crystal Palace results, if they turn into draws or wins, then we're having a completely different conversation here.
Yeah.
But having said that, they've got Man City next. They've got Liverpool coming up soon as well. So I think if they can avoid some of the results they've had against teams below them in the table and improve in that area, because they've been pretty decent against teams in the Big Six or thereabouts, then I think they'll probably have a decent season.
Jack?
I think they can have a very good season just because of how good they are on their day. I think they can beat anybody on their day. And I wouldn't be surprised if they have a series of eye-catching wins in the next few months. They've got Chelsea soon, they've obviously got Manchester City this weekend, they've got Liverpool and Manchester United in December. I don't think there are any games they can't win. I'm just worried that at the same time, they will lose too many games and lose games that they shouldn't lose. So I don't know where they will, maybe that will average out around 5th. That's probably a fair enough position for them to finish in, taking everything into account. And 5th would be the Champions League, which would be progress. But because there's so much variance with Tottenham between Tottenham on a good day and Tottenham on a bad day, it feels difficult to figure out where exactly they'll end up.
And also, quickly, we shouldn't forget, because Postecoglou did that interview with Sky Sports after the North London derby where he said, I always win trophies in his second year, which is true. I think that just adds to the intensity of, and just sort of puts a spotlight on his back and Tottenham's back to be like, well, go ahead then, you've got to do this, you've got to deliver on this. So I think that sort of cranks up the pressure slightly.
Okay.
If you like this video, please consider subscribing to the channel. The Athletic is home to some of the world's best sports journalists, including David Ornstein, Amy Lawrence and James Horncastle. With the latest transfer news and insights on every Premier League story that matters, theathletic.com puts you inside football, and you can try it for free now for 30 days. See the link in the description.